Well, welcome to this event about time on this lovely day, unless you're a Scotsman or Scotswoman, rugby supporter. It's not so good. And I have to just make a few administrative comments right at the outset. Introduce our panellists. We have Dame Gillian Beer, Eva Hoffman, and I'm John Barrow. If you have a mobile phone, can you please turn it off? The proceedings are being recorded and webcast, so if you jump up and wave your arms around, it will be recorded for posterity. So think twice. This is a joint event of the Royal Society with the Royal Society of Literature as part of this One Culture conference and literary festival over this weekend. This is a pioneering venture for the Royal Society, and I hope it's one that's going to be repeated next year and in years to come. It's an opportunity to bring together scientists, authors, critics, dramatists, and also the general public to try to explore ways in which aspects of literature and drama and science are interrelated and can stimulate one another in new ways. The Royal Society, of course, has a wonderful collection of books and manuscripts in its library. It's not just a scientific organisation, but is a wonderful resource and archive for the history of science. I'm going to introduce the other two panellists, tell you a little about their history. They were rather alarmed to find the length of the biographies, which I'd been supplied with, but I'm not going to say very much. And what's then going to happen, we're each going to talk for about just under 10 minutes about some aspect of the theme of time, and then we're going to interrogate each other slightly, and then you're going to come in about halfway through, we hope, with questions and other issues you want us to discuss or questions that we should answer. And we have a total time of 1 hour. Don't believe that clock, it's wrong. It's 10 minutes slow. Well, Dame Gillian Beer, who was the president of Clare Hall College when I joined it just over 10 years ago in Cambridge, is also the Professor of English Literature, the Edward VI Professor of English Literature in Cambridge. And she's very well known as a critic and as a writer. She has very special interests in fiction of the 19th century, and in particular the ways in which developments in science, evolutionary biology, the Industrial Revolution, and we'll see other matters of space and time, impacted upon literature. She has a book in preparation, which you'll see, I suspect, some little pieces of some pictures from in a minute, about the role of space and time in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. So I think the prospective title of that book is Alice in Space, and we're going to hear a bit about Alice in Time, I think, as well today. Eva Hoffman has a very varied and interesting background. She grew up in Krakow and then was educated in the United States. So she's both a literary scholar, PhD in English literature, but then worked as a literary critic, the New York Times. She's trained in music, and she's a renowned novelist and writer of non-fiction. Her most recent book is called Illuminations. If you follow her work, you may know that when it was published in the USA, its title was Appassionata. It couldn't be called that in Britain, unfortunately, because the title had already been taken by somebody else. So look out for that book. Others I know in the past, Lost in Translation, and her other novel, The Secret. She's also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. So that's all we sort of have to say by way of preliminaries, and now we're going to start by listening to me tell you something about time from the perspective of a scientist, but with some links perhaps to the world of literature, some of which may be taken up by my colleagues here. Well, John Wheeler taught us long ago that time exists in order to stop everything happening at once. And if you come from Cambridge, you can usually then add, and space exists to stop everything happening in Cambridge. But time is rather elusive. It seems much more elusive than space. And when we measure time, we never actually seem to measure it. We are measuring the motion of a pendulum through space, or the depth which a pile of sand has sunk in a particular time. So we seem to be measuring distances and saying that they're equivalent to something called time. And we recognise that time is not at all like space, because it doesn't seem to be fundamentally different if you look towards the right or you look towards the left in space. But there is a fundamental psychological difference between the future and the past. There is this phenomenon which scientists and philosophers have always called the arrow of time, the distinction between the future and the past. And because of that distinction, there exist stories. Things change. There are histories. And there is something to explain about the link between the future and the past and the present. This arrow of time, this distinction between the future and the past, is not just a sort of airy-fairy, flaky, subjective, psychological thing either. If you know about the fundamental issue in quantum physics, the wave-particle duality of particles of matter, then one way of resolving or expressing that wave-particle duality is to say that everything in our past is a particle, but everything in our future is a wave. After you've carried out a measurement, things become definite, but before you've measured them, they're just merely probabilities, waves of probability, waves of information, like a crime wave. That's a wave of information. A crime wave hits your area, a crime is more likely to be committed in your area. It's a wave of probability. If you look at cultural attitudes to time, there are ancient and interesting astronomical connections. Where you live 500,000 years ago and onwards determines a lot about what you think about time and change. If you live near the equator, the appearance of the night sky, the intensity of seasonal variations is quite different to what you will experience if you live in Britain or in Scandinavia. So for people who live far from the equator, there is much more feeling of change and time in the pace of life over a year, over a day, over a month. So this cultural difference in attitude to time has this astronomical context. And many of the ways that we measure time, whether it's the day or the month or the year or the seasons, these have an astronomical basis. They would be a shared experience by many cultures. The one that sticks out, the week, if you look at the history of the idea of the week, it has a different length in many different cultures, has different origins. It's purely cultural. It doesn't have an astronomical basis. So some aspects of our timekeeping are astronomical and shared, while others are not. In the history of science, we see that people always like to pick a paradigm or a picture which described how they thought the universe was. So for the early Greeks, at least one complexion of their thinking, the universe was like a great static geometrical harmony. Time wasn't a primary thing for this Platonic picture of the universe. The things that really mattered didn't change with time. By the time of Newton, we have a picture of the universe as a great watch, a great mechanism. At first it sounds as though time might be involved in some important way because it's a watch. But strangely, it wasn't. It was a watch because it was a mechanism, it was reliable, the future was determined uniquely and completely by the present. And so Addison's hymn, "Laws which never shall be broken, for their guidance hath he made," creates this type of world view of determinism. But by the Victorian era, we see machines, industry, the laws of thermodynamics bring change and energy and entropy onto the scene. And works of literature of this period reflect that. The appearance of natural selection, theory of evolution, has its impact upon the world of humanities as well as in science. So as we move to the present, there are other analogies, other paradigms, not really our subject for today, whether the universe is a great symmetry, whether it's a computation. The three types of time that we have to mention, which always play a role and have a somewhat ambiguous or mysterious interrelation, are psychological time, a type of thermodynamic time where things happen, and then a cosmic or geometrical time, which is the framework of the universe. Psychological time is just what it sounds like. When you're having a good time, time tends to go rather rapidly. If you're sitting working at your computer, time flies. But if you're in the dentist's chair, it seems to go awfully slowly. And if you go to Chester Cathedral, there is a clock there which on the door has a poem by Henry Twells. I won't read it all, but it begins with the words, "When I was a child, I laughed and wept, time crept. When as a youth I waxed more bold, time strolled. When I became a full-grown man, time ran. When I older grew, time flew." So this captures this idea of psychological time, of your thinking that time is going rather quicker or slower than some objective measure might indicate. And of course there are forms of literature which take this to heart, exploit it, embroider it, use it in all sorts of interesting ways. The stream of consciousness writers, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and others, play with this psychological time. Lots of pages go past, but maybe not much real time. And different characters in the story may be pacing themselves and experiencing time at different rates. And when they're put in interaction, this has interesting consequences. Thermodynamic time is all about the rate at which things happen. This is the time that you worry about if you're a chemist, or you're a biologist, or you're a pharmacologist, or a physicist. So it's governed very much by thermodynamics and events and the doing of work. And in the 19th century, the appearance of the laws of thermodynamics had a great cultural effect. In the early 20th century, they were pushed forward very much by writers like Eddington and Jeans, who brought this picture of the heat death of the universe and thermodynamics to a very wide readership. I always remember in one of Dorothy Sayers' novels, one of the Peter Wimsey stories, Have His Carcass. Wimsey is interviewing a witness to the discovery of the corpse on the beach, and she's a servant girl from the hotel, and she's terribly confused in what she remembers and what she has to say, and becomes very apologetic and said that she really is a terrible witness, and what she has to say won't be of any use whatsoever to Lord Wimsey. But he says, on the contrary, we have learnt from the laws of thermodynamics that we expect things to become more and more disorganized and difficult to understand and chaotic. And it's this quality of your evidence that gives it the hallmark of truth. It's in tune with the nature of the universe. Well, the third type of time to jump to quickly is perhaps the most pervasive, and that's cosmic time or universal time. Back in Newton's day, 300 years ago, it was believed that there was an absolute time. It couldn't be altered in any way. It was shared by everyone. And the things that Newton's laws described happened against this background of linear, inexorable progress in time. Well, Einstein changed all that in the early years of the 20th century. The two theories of relativity joined together space and time into what then be called space-time. That was the fundamental unit of structure in the universe. And the rate at which time flowed depended on your motion relative to other clocks. And this gave rise to all sorts of paradoxes and possibilities to exploit this flexibility in the passage of time. The famous example is that of the twins. If you have two identical twins born at exactly the same moment, not quite possible gynecologically, but we are physicists, so let's imagine that this is possible. One of them stays at home, one is sent on a trip at very high velocity through space, and then returns to meet his brother. So the travelling twin will have aged less on this trip. When he comes back, he will find that his brother is a different age to himself. So he has, in effect, time travelled into the future of his brother. So in the theory of relativity, time travel into the future is uncontroversial, happens all the time, it's observed in experiments. What is rather more controversial is time travel into the past. So the time machine scenario of H.G. Wells, because people imagine that if you can travel into the past, you can tinker with events there and produce a factual contradiction with something that exists now. This is in fact a fallacy. You can't do that. There are not two pasts, one that actually happened and another one that you can go and change. A good little picture of this is to imagine we have some people marching along in a straight line, one behind the other here, and if they move in a straight line, it's like linear time. Everyone is either in front of someone else or behind them, and there is no ambiguity about that. But suppose the people now walk in a circle, then everybody is both in front of everybody else and behind them. So all that you can have is a self-consistent ordering of the marching people in a circle, what we might call a self-consistent history. So if we were writing a story with a self-consistent history, it might be a little like this. Suppose I decide to travel backwards in time, and I wish to create a crisis of fact in the universe by shooting myself when I was a few weeks old as a baby in my mother's arms. And I see my mother holding myself as a baby, I raise my rifle, I go to pull the trigger to shoot myself. But at that moment, I feel a spasm in my shoulder from an old injury, and it makes the gun jump. It goes bang, which frightens my mother, who drops the baby, who injures his shoulder. So this would be a self-consistent history. They can exist, but you can't go back and change things. There are many other of these paradoxes of this sort, and the last sort that we see in literature occasionally is the idea of having more than one time, or having events occurring in parallel. C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories are like that, and occasionally there's a discussion between the professor, you remember, who owned the house with the wardrobe, and Peter, professor, sort of decrying the fact that in schools they're not being taught about other times and dimensions and so forth, and he can't understand why this isn't on the curriculum. So there you've got two parallel worlds that can be very close in space, but they operate on different timescales. Well, a sentence only about string theory. String theory allows you to have not only other dimensions of space, but also other dimensions of time. What is mysterious about theories of physics of that sort today is that they tell you that the number of dimensions of space and time has to be special. But they don't tell you anything about how many of them can be times and how many of them can be spaces. So I hope this gives you a little bit of background for some of the scientific aspects of time and of space, that we no longer think of time as unchangeable and absolute. It is one of the things that depends on how you're moving, if you're moving at high speed, and depends on the strength of gravity and what objects are in your vicinity. So you can make clocks go fast or you can make clocks go slow relative to other clocks simply by changing the gravitational field that they experience and the other events that are in their vicinity. So I think that's more than enough from me. And Eva, you're going to tell us something about some other aspects of narrative and history and psychological time.
Yes. You have given me the perfect transition into my talk, because I should declare at the outset that my interest is not in the time of the cosmos or of physics although I am in awe of people who study it and understand it, but it is in human time. That is how time is patterned and processed within our bodies and minds and psyches, and whether there are any limits or structures in human time that we need to think about and respect. And I suppose I should mention that my credibility in this terrain, such as it is, comes from my very last book, which was in fact called Time, and which was a series of essays on this subject. And so, however, I realize that even minus the cosmos, this is a rather large subject. To begin with, time for us humans has two guises, or at least two guises. On one level, it is the great given, the element we live in and cannot leap out of, in which, whatever its possible directions in the cosmos, in our lives moves faithfully in one direction only, from birth to death. And I wonder if that is what our sense of the past and the future may come from. But lived time is also a highly malleable entity, susceptible to human shaping and construction. And John mentioned some of the different conceptions of time in different cultures, and my sort of intense preoccupation with the subject of time partly came from my immigration from Poland to America, and my sense that time was deployed and constructed very differently in these two cultures. And of course, time is one of the great subjects of art, especially what might be called the narrative arts. That is, arts which themselves move through time, literature, film, and in a different, though very powerful way, music. For these forms, time is not only a frequent theme, but it is the basic material from which they are made. Music, above all, derives its meaning largely from the shaping of time. But on this occasion, I want to talk not about any specific works of literature or art, but to offer a few brief, and I hope not too reckless, speculations about the sources of the narrative impulse within the mind and subjectivity, and what this may tell us about the need for, as well as the pleasures of literary or imaginative narrative. Narrative, in the sense of storytelling, is a very old human habit, and there have been some interesting conjectures about its evolutionary uses. To put it simply, we need to know what happened to the hunters as they ventured into that unfamiliar territory, and so we listen eagerly to their tales. But I want to suggest, partly on the basis of recent findings in various life sciences, that imaginative constructions of temporality help us make sense not only of the external world and its possibilities and dangers, but of internal time and ourselves and our own histories, as John hinted, and that the need for this is built into our minds and psyches. In recent decades, explorations of consciousness have moved from psychology and philosophy to the domain of neuroscience. This is, in fact, one of the strong meeting points between the sciences and the humanities and the sciences and the arts. And while the neurological mapping of temporal consciousness is in its early stages, what is being discovered there is very suggestive. It is interesting to me that there seem to be temporal limits built into our brains as well as into our bodies. Although thought sometimes seems to happen at the speed of light, or no speed at all, it turns out that having a thought actually takes minuscule but measurable quanta of time. And if we try to push our brains beyond that speed limit, as we might do in, say, multitasking, the brain becomes, in one of those ironies that time plays on us, less efficient instead. It turns out that it takes more brain energy to shift from one register of thought or activity to another than to follow a straight line of activity, which is why people who do multitasking habitually eventually become less good at it than people who don't. Their brain slows down. But the brain is also apparently capable of great plasticity and a kind of innate inventiveness. The basic spatiotemporal template of the brain is laid down very early in our development. But each new experience or piece of information alters the neurological patterns we carry inside ourselves. The brain selects, categorizes, and assigns different values to memories continuously in the light and context of its own neurological history and its internal network of connections. And that network of connections is also continuously changed by new input or experiences. So it seems that each person's specific experiential map or history is initially created in a tracery of neurons and synapses, and that the kinds of modifications of that history or narrative, which we might call interpretation and revision, are also built into the material dynamics of the mind. Such capacities for plastic response and change have led some neuroscientists to speak of the brain's autopoiesis, that is, poetic self-creation. But our sense of unique and personal identity depends not only on the purely perceptual recognition of chronological continuity or the purely cognitive registration of memories. It is from within our subjectivity, that domain of sometimes unconscious feeling and conscious thought, of hopes and fears and unhappiness and joy, that we experience ourselves fully as subjects, and that our experiences gain the weight of personal meaning. How emotions are made and of what materials is still very unclear. But is it possible that in this more elusive domain, there are also unwritten laws of temporality, laws or patterns or structures? Clearly, again, as John suggested, measurable evidence here is harder to come by, and time within the psyche moves in distinctly non-chronological ways. Affective time can indeed move backwards and in other more aleatory directions as well. However, it has been found that extreme distortions of time are associated with mental malaise or illness, so that in depression, the perception of time is twice as slow as the actual passage of time. In certain states of psychosis or schizophrenia, inner time is completely severed from external or real time, so that an hour may seem to take a day or vice versa. Contemporary syndromes, I think very suggestively, are syndromes like ADD, attention deficit disorder, or borderline personality disorder, tend to have to do with the fragmentation of time and with the intolerance for more extended duration, so that people who suffer from ADD really cannot concentrate for more than a very brief segment of time. People who suffer from borderline personality disorder cannot make connections between one moment of their experience and another, between their experiences. And this results in considerable neurotic suffering, as it might be called. So all of this suggests that there are patterns of subjective temporality which we need to respect and honor. And even without the disturbances of pathology, our sensations of pleasure or pain seem to be deeply raveled with temporal perceptions. And John mentioned some of the basic sort of axioms of subjective relativity. Time goes fast when you're having fun, and time goes by very slowly when you're anxiously waiting for some bit of uncertain news. A certain temperate tempo gives us a sense of quiet well-being. So it seems that in a sense, time is constructed from within us, and that it is accompanied by what neuroscientists call qualia, or subjective sensations. Time is very directly linked, in other words, with our sense of subjectivity. But beyond that, if we're not to suffer from extreme inner fragmentation, we need also to make sense of the psychic flux and to make links between our felt past and lived present. And this cannot be accomplished without the more overarching processes of introspection and retrospection, of self-examination and reflection. A basic cognitive chronological memory is necessary to our sense of continuity and a stable sense of self, literally recognizing ourselves from day to day, and therefore on a fundamental level knowing who we are. For people whose brain has been damaged in the areas which store memory, this very capacity for self-recognition disappears. And I think of some of the very poignant and fascinating studies by Oliver Sacks of people who lose their immediate memory and who literally don't know that they have been in this room a minute ago. But I think that if we don't make the more affective or reflective connections between our personal past and present, then we lose the sense that our experiences and selves have meaning. In order to orient ourselves in the inner topography of our life's events and stages, we need to keep interpreting and putting together an internal, fully autobiographical story and a narrative, what some thinkers have called a narrative identity. And that not only takes time, but it takes another kind of time, the kinds of intervals in which we can allow our thoughts to meander and our imaginations to make unexpected connections, in which we can perhaps expand the moment in order to contemplate it, or leap backwards from the present to the past in order to arrive at a new understanding. Above all, the construction of the more extended time within us happens through the unpredictable, often digressive, sometimes involuntary processes of affective memory, that very plastic faculty through which we don't only recollect the past, but interpret and reinterpret its meanings and patterns. We are apparently the only species capable of imagining time in a longue durée, of conceiving the non-immediate and sometimes remote vistas of the past and future. Our capacity to imagine the future brings with it one formative piece of knowledge, the knowledge of our own mortality. This difficult awareness is undoubtedly one of the great spurs to creativity in the first place. But I think it is one of the deep pleasures and the profound value of the temporal arts and literary narratives that they give us representations of inner time as well as external time, and that they allow us to articulate and ponder the ways in which we mold lived time and weave a richly textured, narrativized sense of self. And literature, incidentally, can convey those qualia of pain and pleasure and some more subtle sensations as well, which are so difficult to convey in objective description or through measurements. The varieties of narrative forms and formulations of temporality are nearly infinite, and the list of poets and writers who have given us beautiful meditations on time or accounts of their struggles with this inexorable element is nearly endless. But perhaps one can mention modernism, as in fact you did, we're overlapping quite a bit, as a period of particularly intense explorations of human temporality and human consciousness altogether. The fictions of such writers as Virginia Woolf or Proust or Joyce rarely follow the straight linear structure of earlier realist fiction. Rather, they can give us all the valences of subjective time, the fleeting moment, the meanderings of thought, the simultaneously of past and present. They register what some thinkers call the heterochrony of internal time, the coexistence within subjectivity of many scales and dimensions of time. I don't know what new kinds of narrative may be yielded by our period in culture. Part of my concern in thinking about this is that I think we have created a culture of fast time and a kind of speed ethos, partly through our sort of coexistence with digital technologies, and that we increasingly sort of live and function within the temporality, within a kind of digital temporality of very brief and segmented time fragments. And that through this we may curtail our capacities for those processes of reflection, imagination, empathy, and indeed intellectual inquiry, which require more extended durations of time. Of course, as a writer of books, I worry that the very temporality of the book, of the long text, may not fit with the modalities of fast time. Although I don't want to underestimate the possibilities for inventiveness and creativity brought to us by the internet, or even, who knows, texting. At the same time, I hope that not all new narratives will be brought to us by Twitter, not only because of wanting to protect my own very threatened turf, but because I think that the longer and deeper awareness of time and the kinds of knowledge and self-knowledge it brings to us are necessary for our own ordinary, ongoing creativity and a fully human sense of who we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Gillian's going to tell us something, I think, about Alice in Wonderland and Lewis Carroll and the nature of time. And she has some slides as well.
Yes, one or two. Just pictures, really, from them. Oh, well, he can sit there for the moment, because I'm not going to go straight into Lewis Carroll, because I want to take up a point that has already been made by Eva. The the new form of literary unities, that the Aristotelian unities, which are place, time, and action, insist on the congruity of all the events of a single day, and they have within them the capacity to drive forward in great intensity, often towards a tragic outcome. We see that, say, in Racine or Corneille. Strikingly, a number of 20th century writers have equally dwelt on the single day. We think of Joyce in Ulysses, or Virginia Woolf in Between the Acts, or Mrs. Dalloway. But what's emphasized in their work is rather the heterogeneity, the multiple forms that time takes within that 24-hour span, the way in which it means something different to each person concerned. So that Woolf in particular strives to demonstrate how prehistory is part of the present, how an aeon and a moment can equally be described in a sentence. And that capacity to describe in that pithy way completely different segments of time, I think, is one of the ways in which we have to come to terms with time in literature, that it's not going to be entirely sequential or pacing itself with a kind of natural step. It's going to allow us to see things either in summary or in an immensely expanded, intricate, moment-by-moment register. And when she was writing to the Lighthouse, Woolf went to visit Thomas Hardy, now a very old man, and she records his declared puzzlement at the organisation of, say, Aldous Huxley's novels, another modernist writer. And this is what Hardy said. "They've changed everything now," he said. "We used to think there was a beginning, a middle, and an end. We believed in the Aristotelian theory. Now, one of those stories came to an end with a woman going out of a room." He chuckled. That refusal of closure baffles the desire to complete a sequence or a story, but of course it's also a way of calling attention to time, as one sees also with the riddles that don't have an answer in Lewis Carroll's Alice books, where they, as it were, ebb outwards, instead of being closed down in that satisfactory disappointment that one gets when, among the universe of possibilities, the single answer, which is usually rather piffling, of a riddle is disclosed. I think that feeling that stories must offer fulfillment, completeness, a moment at least of acquiescence in a pace of time which is tolerable, has been one of the great pleasures for literature in the making of time. But then, of course, no human life has a single shape. The biological sequence of living draws us from birth and childhood through the funnel of puberty to adulthood, and if we're lucky, on to old age and death. And that propulsive force, that temporality, offers one arc for understanding, onward, inexorable. But at the same time, every day of our lives is a play across our constitutive memories, those things that we can't help remembering, those things that we wish to remember. And the shape of a human life, as it's lived, I think is less a shape often than a perturbation, a mingling of self and surroundings, experience throbbing with materials drawn from known and unknown sources. Not so much an arc, but a welter. And through that, we seek narratives that will clarify and yet also be capable of carrying complexity. So they don't drive out complexity, but they keep it in poise. And literature is certainly one of the creative ways that we come intimately to understand and enter multiple time simultaneously. We aren't, as it were, dividing out that long arc from this perturbation that I described. The narratives that we meet in story, in literature, they may be the recurrence of routine actions or the coherence of dreams, that become incoherent only on waking, or long trajectories such as desire or yearning or nostalgia. And they often find their form in fairy tales or in daily news and in any of the fictions that permeate and make up our actuality. I often worry about, well, I don't worry about it, I think about how is it we can distinguish Hamlet from Queen Elizabeth? Do they actually occupy different spaces, one as a fiction, one as a person? No, they overlap. Hamlet has become so integrated into our language that we can no longer think of him solely as a fictional medium. But at the same time, what do we actually know about Queen Elizabeth? We have invented her. We've made her as a fiction. And literature increases the capacity of the individual to reflect on the everyday. It stretches, it prolongs, it surprises. Now, a lot of the work I do is in 19th and 20th century literature, and one of the things that's most struck me is the way in which time shifts in the mid-19th century, because there are stupendous changes in imagined timescales, what you have to get used to. Through geology and evolutionary theory, millions of years were evoked. But of course, Darwin himself very shrewdly pointed out how difficult it is for human beings to distinguish between 10,000 years and 10 million years. We're baffled by that distinction. And at the same time, much more minute time scales were being pinpointed and recorded than had previously been possible, especially in relation to the nervous system and reaction time. The 60th of a second became newly important. Clearly, all these scientific realizations have their effect in the making of a literature of a place and a time. But I think it's perhaps worth just pausing a moment before one imagines that everything then goes pell-mell according to these new versions of time, to realize how people were still reading Milton's Paradise Lost, say, which endowed the mythic Christian past with an epic temporal scale that enlarged the scope of history. So it didn't, as it were, stick to the 10,000-year model. And Paradise Lost itself very much inspired different scientists at the time, Charles Darwin, James Clerk Maxwell, John Tyndall, for example. Tyndall believed that studying Milton's grammar, with its suspension through time within sentences, had given him a grasp of complexity, duration, and reach that fueled his studies, his later studies in chemistry too. He wrote in an address to students, this is 1868-69, "English grammar was the most important discipline of my boyhood. The piercing through the involved and inverted sentences of Paradise Lost, the linking of the verb to its often distant nominative, of the relative to its transitive verb, of the preposition to the noun or pronoun which it governed, the study of variations in mood or tense, the transpositions often necessary to bring out the true grammatical structure of a sentence, all this was to my young mind a discipline of the highest value and a source of unflagging delight." You can hear in that sentence how much is learnt from Milton, indeed, how to keep a sentence going, how to give that sense of adding in more and more temporal aspects as you gather the thing to its climax. Well, given the vastness of this topic of time and the time constraints of our own discussion, I'm just going to focus in these last few minutes on one particularly telling perturbation of time that's performed in literature in the mid-19th century, very much in the wake of some of these scientific discoveries and realizations. And that's Lewis Carroll's two books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. Of course, Lewis Carroll was a mathematician and a logician. And so temporality is fundamental to him because it's fundamental both to logic and to possible worlds. And Wonderland is preceded by Tenniel's image of the dapper white rabbit, which I hope is going to appear yet. Oh, no, it hasn't. We've got a little bit further. There he is. Earnestly consulting his watch. And it's the watch that startles Alice. A rabbit with pink eyes runs past her, and I quote, "There was nothing so very remarkable in that." Nor did Alice think it so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be too late." But when the rabbit actually, and these words are italicized by Carol, took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it, and then hurried on, Alice started to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it, and burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it. Now, you notice this is no Palian watch, sort of abandoned in a field to prompt thoughts of the maker behind the manufactured object. No assurance that God's design is implied. It's a watch which is out of kilter, which is challenging human exceptionalism. The watch usually signifies the peculiarly human capacity to invent complex technology, but here it's shared with a well-dressed rabbit. Of course, it's just after George Boole had pointed out that it's perfectly possible to have a category with just one instance in it. So perhaps that's what this is. There is such a category, rabbits with watches, one rabbit in it. It's been much studied, the new technologies of regularized time in the mid-19th century, and it's clear that the watch, along with the factory clock, controlled industrial production. At the Mad Hatter's tea party, I think the Hatter may be grandstanding. Remember, he has a watch that tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is. And I came across in a novel of Bulwer Lytton, where his hero, Pelham, displays considerable hauteur towards the whole question of watches. He shudders at the idea of owning even a very expensive watch, because, as he says, "Do you think I could ever wear a watch? I know of nothing so plebeian. What can anyone but a man for business, who has 9 hours for his counting house and 1 for his dinner, ever possibly want to know the time for?" The Alice books appeared just when railways and their timetables had newly required the regularising of time across the whole British Isles. And Carol was a railway enthusiast. I could talk more about that, but I won't at the moment. And Dan Falk, in his very interesting book called In Search of Time, quotes a note from the Great Western Railway timetable that I think sounds a little bit like a passage from Alice itself. It refers to Stephenson time, which is actually, of course, George Stephenson, the railway pioneer. This is what it explains. London time is kept at all stations on the railway, which is about 4 minutes earlier than Reading time, 5.5 minutes before Stephenson time, 7.5 minutes before Cirencester time, 8 minutes before Chippenham time, and 14 minutes before Bridgewater time. So space and time at this period are coming to be understood more and more as being in intricate relations. Chronometers keeping time at sea, making it possible, indeed, for the mapping of colonial claims. The new technology of the photograph, of which Lewis Carroll was an early adept, which froze and made portable a moment and a place, and which also demanded at that period long and rigid passivity from its subjects. And as Jimena Canales has recently pointed out, 1/10 of a second had become a newly significant time unit because it was concerned with measuring the speed of the nervous system. And as so often, Hermann von Helmholtz was in the van of all these studies, working in relation to this, particularly on reaction time. Of course, without him, optics, acoustics, all these elements would not be there for us in the form they are now. But he wrote an article in the Academy, which I'll just briefly quote a little bit of, where he says that he's obliged to come to the somewhat startling conclusion that the axioms of Euclid may be perhaps only approximately true, because he demonstrates the logical congruity of conceiving intelligent beings living on ellipsoids, on pseudospherical surfaces, in 2 dimensions, in 4, and he concludes by pointing out that the axioms on which our geometrical system is based are no necessary truths. They are the scientific expression of a most general fact of experience, the fact, namely, that in our space, bodies can move freely through time without altering their form. Not, of course, entirely what Alice experiences, as she's crushed into the space of the rabbit's house, or finds her head swaying on an elongated neck in the canopy of a tree. And I think Lewis Carroll is clearly playing with some of these jokes about time and space that are current then, remembering that he is a Don at Oxford, that he is a mathematician and a logician. And he plays on these new ideas of time as well as their age-old anxieties. Oh, the Duchess, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting, as the poor white rabbit keeps saying. And industrial, scientific, technological changes aren't the only markers of temporality in these two books. So we have sundials, solar time, dreams, and tenses, each adding their diverse calculations and processes. Because our daytime timekeeping, it turns out, is not the only possible way of experiencing the chronic time in its extension. So dream is, of course, one kind of time order in the Alice books, but both books also explore the expansion and intricacy that games discover in time, whether the game be croquet or chess. Games make intricate time process, and much of their enjoyment lies in that. But they also have a goal, and therefore a control. And in the Looking Glass world, Alice does eventually become a queen when, as a pawn, she reaches the end of the board. And that would seem to be part of a linear, or at least an extremely erratic and often not very linear progress across the chessboard, but she gets there in the end. But that temporal purposiveness of chess is inverted by the time order of things as they exist behind the looking glass, where people are imprisoned before they commit a crime, and the queen screams before she pricks herself, and to approach things you have to walk away, and to stay in one place you have to run fast. Well, in our country, I think I've got a picture here. Oh, I've left out the curlicues, yes. Oh, and there's the Sleeping King. And here is, this is Salvador Dali and his picture of Alice's imprisonment. And here, finally, is a wonderful image which does get the feeling of motion and time. And poor Alice is saying, you'd certainly get somewhere else if you ran very fast for a long time, as we've been doing. A slow sort of country, said the Queen. Now here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. Carroll, intriguingly, seems first to have conceived the book on the plane of a chessboard, a homoloid, and later added the optical reversing effects of the mirror. And in this way, he challenges our conventional assumptions about the universality of time as we experience it. And all those questions about universal time were then current, as one can find if one goes and studies some of his friends, like J.J. Sylvester, who, intriguingly, both is being president of the mathematical section of the British Association for the Advancement of Science and writing a book on poetic metre at the same time. So these two things are very close together just then, and the idea of play among mathematicians was held up as the ideal. And Sylvester himself said that what we've got to train our students to is to realize that impossibilities and possible worlds are what they should be studying. So, thank you.
Do you want to have some questions from the audience? Okay. Just make a comment and then we'll have some questions from the audience. That there's a two-way relation between literature and subjects like relativity. There's a famous mathematics teacher in Britain who taught at Winchester College called Clement Jurel. If you're the right age, you may have had to endure some of his textbooks when you were at school. And he once wrote a book, which I think is now out of print, called Readable Relativity. It has a foreword by Freeman Dyson, who was a pupil in Clement Durrell's class when he was at Winchester College. And Readable Relativity is rather clever. It was his attempt to teach the special theory of relativity to some of his sixth formers. And he used the story of Alice through the looking glass. Because if you look at the world in a curved mirror, the geometry changes. And it changes to the geometry of a world governed by special relativity. So his clever trick was to show that if you looked at the ordinary world of Newtonian motion in a curved mirror, then the laws of adding velocities and relative motion that you would deduce are exactly the ones of special relativity. So it was this looking glass world that he used as a device to explain the theory of relativity, rather than just to take the ideas of relativity to create a story.
Yes, and it's striking that J.J. Sylvester indeed talks about the way in which W.K. Clifford has recently been, as he puts it, rumpling time and space and suggesting that we may be living on what to us seems like a flat page, but in fact it's being gradually bent up. So these things are going to and fro, and there certainly was a great deal of emphasis on play in that period. Mm.
Let's have some questions from the audience. There are some roving microphones which will come towards you if you put your hand up. One lady over there.
Could I ask Professor Beer what she was referring to as universal time?
Did I use that phrase?
You use that phrase, and I'm interested in that in relation to the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland.
Yes. I think by universal time there, I was referring to the assumption that there was a sequence which is implicit and inevitable through the human lifespan, and that is a universal form of time, however many other forms of time exist.
So you're referring to a universal time within the lifespan?
Yes, yes.
I see, because recently I studied Alice in Wonderland and the White Rabbit as Alice's spiritual guide. Mm-hmm. So I was seeing it more as universal time in terms of infinity, as in the rabbit, opposed to temporal time, as in the watch of the rabbit.
Well, that's intriguing. But why is the rabbit eternal? We don't know that he won't die. He is another life form, equivalent to Alice. He just is a different form.
Yes, but if he's her spiritual guide, then he could be in touch with infinity.
He could be if he is her spiritual guide. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. This is just a quick question for Professor Barrow. I mean, in literature, there are gaps in time and so on. Inevitably, you can't write anything without these gaps. But is it possible, actually, for time itself to have gaps, that you could actually have empty time? I mean, is time continuous or discrete? Of course, that's a related question. But it's obviously a theoretical matter because the universe is ticking away. But supposing, and could you have time that's just empty?
Well, I think most physicists who work on quantum gravity would regard that there is a smallest interval of time that they're happy to talk about. And it could be that time really is discrete in little ticks of 10 to the minus 43 of a second, that it's not fully continuous. One doesn't know for sure. But it wouldn't be unexpected if in the future you had a fully working theory of space and time which predicted rather strongly that time was discrete, but with this tiny graininess of intervals. So if you wanted a clock to say what's the age of the universe today, instead of saying 10 to the 17 seconds or 13 billion years, you would say 10 to the power 60 of these ticks, of these Planck times. But whether you could have a gap in time, well, you can have a description of space-time that, as it were, has an edge in space and in time, so things can come to an end in space, and then you could glue something else on the other side, and the two pieces glued together would be an acceptable mathematical universe. But if you tried to go through that discontinuity, then all sorts of odd things can happen. So time can have an end. I think this is, as well as a beginning, this is one of the oddities of Einstein's theory of general relativity and our description of what the universe could be like. That if you're in the right type of universe or the wrong type of universe, time might have an end, not just for you, but for everything. And one of the, I always think, the strangest things about modern astronomy and cosmology is, you can walk around in Scandinavia and northern Scotland, you can pick up a rock which is 3 or 4 billion years old. But if we believe what the expansion of the universe is telling us, if you were to go back in time just, not even 4 or 5 times that age, more than 14 billion years ago, there wouldn't be any time. There might be a beginning to space and time, nothing at all. And that really is unimaginable. Someone, read, and then...
Thank you. May I ask you to comment on the possibility that subatomic particles may be travelling faster than the speed of light? And if the experiment is repeated and it is proven, what effect this might have on the theory of relativity? Professor Barrow, thank you.
I don't take these claims very seriously at all, and I will be very interested to see whether the mistake lies in inaccurate measurement of the time of flight or inaccurate measurement of the distance travelled. And in fact, only yesterday there was a rather convincing paper placed on the archive that indicated that rather important considerations had been omitted about the effect of the rotation of the Earth on the timing. And when you have to time things to the accuracy of a few nanoseconds, those uncertainties are rather bigger than that. So I'm not changing my pattern of work.
I just wanted to ask Professor Barrow, you talked about the space of a week as being a cultural kind of time. Are there, in fact, parts of the world still now where time is not measured, where they don't recognise a 7-day week?
I'm not sure what the situation is in parts of Malaysia or Indonesia. I mean, certainly long time ago, there were systems operating in a 9-day week there. The ancient Egyptians, of course, used a 10-day week, and during the French Revolution, they tried to reinstate that system. During the Russian Revolution, there was an attempt to not only change the number of days in the week, but have a continuous working week with everybody programmed into a different start day. So often in cultures on the other side of the world, say where there's a different number of days to the week, the centrepiece of the week is the market day. So in African tribes, village culture, the market is the central time. And the market day defines the periodicity of the week.
That does seem to suggest that it is a cultural
Yes.
form, the week, if it can vary like that in different parts of the world.
And may I add that there is, for example, a wonderful essay by Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. Now, this was written about 40 years ago, so I'm not sure whether it still obtains, but it's called Time, Person, and Conduct in Bali. And he describes this incredibly intricate kind of calendrical system in which various calendrical mappings overlap, and also each day has its own manifestation. I mean, each day manifests itself as itself, and in the meantime you have overlapping circles of various intervals, all of which are apparently constructed in the service of creating a sense of permanence and stasis, so that all generations coexist simultaneously within the system.
Our system, 7 days, there's argument about that there are two possible sources. I mean, there's the Jewish tradition, with the 7 days of creation, and there's a Babylonian astrological system of 7 days because there were 7 objects in the sky, planets and the moon and the sun, ordered by their periods of revolution around the sky. And the way you track what's going on is to look at the words for the days. And as you get further and further north away from the centre of the Holy Roman Empire, you find more and more days of the week are related either to Roman gods or to the Norse equivalent of the same god. So we have, Wednesday, Woden's Day, Thursday, Thor's Day, and in particular Saturday is Saturn's Day. But get closer to the Holy Roman Empire and it becomes Sabbato, it's the Sabbath. It's not astrological. And Sunday is not the day of the sun, it's the day of the Lord. It's Domine, Domingo, Dimanche. So there's this sort of interaction between those two traditions. And as you got further north in Europe, so the pagan words seem to predominate over the religious origins. So, gentleman there, and then lady at the...
Yes, can you have time in a world where there are no events, where nothing happens? You made a distinction between psychological time, and indeed Professor Beer elaborated on that, then physical time, so we see that thermodynamics, but then what you called cosmic time, which you related also to the absolute time of Newton, which seems to be a non-event related time. But can you have time without events, without things happening? Thank you.
I think the answer is yes. If you just look at it theoretically, there are solutions of Einstein's equations, every one of which describes a universe where nothing happens. And the world of special relativity is one. So there are universes that are always the same, and they are the same in every place. So there are no events, and one place and one time just looks the same as any other. One of the aims of Fred Hoyle and Herman Bondi and Tommy Gold in inventing the steady state theory of the universe at the end of the 1940s was to create a situation where the universe was like that on the average, so that the past history of the universe on the average always looked the same. So this meant that its density and its temperature and other things had to look on the average the same. Like sitting next to a flowing, steadily flowing river. Okay, it's not static. There is change, but on the average, it's always the same. But if there was no river, and the world was empty, that would be static.
I wanted to ask each of the panelists if they could say, leaving aside Alice in Wonderland, which piece of writing, fiction or non-fiction, has most interested them in terms of its dealings with time or its capacity to stimulate thoughts about time or its ability to play with time on the page.
Well, there are so many. One could mention, I think, of Emily Dickinson, who has such wonderful metaphors for internal time and its vicissitudes. Pain expands the time, pain contracts the time. But I suppose the book I would think about is Speak Memory by Nabokov. And it's partly, I suppose, because he is simultaneously aware of time as itself, as this inexorable element. He called himself a chronophobiac. he said that he dated the birth of his consciousness to the awareness of time at the age of 4, but that he lived in dread of this element, because there was a past in which he did not exist, there will be a future in which he would not exist. So he gives full brief of that, but he counterposes these interweavings of memory, this, sort of intricate carpet of memory through which he reclaims the past, and various scales and various levels of memory, his own memory, but also he extends himself to the memory of his mother, which he internalizes fully, which he kind of absorbs as if it were his own. It is just a wonderful meditation on time.
But I think I would think of the time machine, partly because it's such a good corrective to the idea of evolution inevitably going upwards towards complexity. And you remember that in the time machine he goes into further and further and further onward time until he reaches a point where there's just a low red light and a few amoeba and some hideous thing flopping around, and you realize that transformation is not necessarily something which is going to give pleasure and where you feel that you've reached a higher state, but something so alien, so far off that you can't encompass it imaginatively.
I pick a sort of a more mixed topic that's been in different writings, some of mine, some of other people's, and it's this odd question of living forever. So what are the puzzles and issues and problems and peculiarities of living forever? So where nothing in some sense would ever turn out to be original if you waited long enough. There wouldn't be any secrets. There would be no end to the sequence of pieces of advice that you would expect to receive when your mother-in-law is still alive and her mother-in-law's mother-in-law, and so on forever. No craftsman or person making anything would ever be able to finish because there would be no end to the amount of advice that they would have to receive from their father or their mother or other relatives. So as you start to think about these problems of living forever, you could imagine how new religions might spring up that promised finite life as an escape from this torture and imprisonment of a never-ending future.
Yeah. Yes, in fact, in Between the Acts, Virginia Woolf works with that imagination of how necessary it is that things should die, and yet the whole book is a kind of bulwark against the sense that perhaps everything is about to collapse because it's written right at the beginning of the war. So,
and there is a very interesting novel by Simone de Beauvoir called All Men Are Mortal, which is about a man who is immortal. And it is a nightmare condition because nothing matters to him after a while. No risks are real risks. No other person has great meaning. No attachment has great meaning because they will disappear and he will go on, etc., etc. A kind of existential vision of hell. But it also kind of points up how much we need, in a sense, a sense of an ending in order to give significance to our experiences.
Well, I think that's a good question to end our discussion on. I remember the story that's told that once the Astronomer Royal was the chairperson for a lecture by Henry Bergson on the non-existence of time. And Professor Bergson apologized at the end. He was unable to stay and answer questions because he had to go and catch a train. Well, we've, I think, kept to our time, that time you shouldn't believe at all. Thank you very much for listening so patiently. We're going to sign books and probably talk to you and answer any other questions you might feel are pressing in a room called City of London 2, which I think is to the left after you go out of the door. So thank you very much.